Hi everybody, TJ Mack Vintage Cards and Nostalgia here, and we're on the cusp of 2024, and while I'm not doing a video today on my collecting goals, I have some thoughts that run through my head of how I want to continue my collecting journey in the upcoming year. As I get older, I've talked about this before, how I want my collection to be one of deep meaning. I don't need the biggest, the best, to acquire the cards to please others. I want meaning. A collection that I can look at that conjures up emotions, a time capsule to the past, a return to simpler times, the days when I would sit on my bed in my room on a cold winter Sunday afternoon as I thumbed through a stack of football cards. There would be the sound of the NFL game of the week that would be blaring from my parents' old black and white television that they gave me. It was the first one that they bought after getting married in 1969. And I remember distinctly the voice of Merlin Olsen, who would do the games on NBC with Dick Enberg back in the late 70s and into the 80s. His voice was soft and comforting. He was one of those people that when you're a kid, he made you feel safe, at ease with the world. No wonder he was the spokesman for FTD Flowers. You have the 6'5", 270-pound former defensive tackle carrying a bouquet of flowers. A true gentle giant. And when I see his cards, it takes me back to those days. And these are ones that I just want to have in my collection to make those connections. One of the things that continues to run through my mind is the convergence of magazines with my card collection. It's a theme of my collecting that I keep going back to. I find myself acquiring cards of players that I read about in the pages of magazines such as this 1968 Sport. Now, I touched on this magazine about a year or so ago because it talked about the 1968 season, which is one I'm fascinated with due to it being the year of the pitcher. And it was one of those seasons that changed the game. His pitching became so dominant that year that baseball made changes to the game in 1969 to level the playing field between the pitcher and the batter. And when I look at the magazines in real time, it just takes me back to those days. And I just love having the cards from those seasons that I can look through, and as I reminisce about those days of acquiring those cards in my collection and just reading the stories about those players. And it's not even times necessarily like that I've talked about before that I lived in, but when I read them in real time, it makes me feel as if I'm there. And that's what I just love about the articles in the magazines. And you can see here that I just have a box of some of my 1968 cards here, and it's just fun to go through that and just, like I said, look at the magazines and just see all these wonderful cards in my collection. Now, one of the articles in this magazine from Sport 1968 talks about who the best middle linebacker in football today was. And I just found it very insightful. It interviewed 5 ex-pro middle linebackers. They were Bill Pellington, Les Richter, Bill George, Chuck Bednarik, and Joe Schmidt. And 4 of those 5 guys are in the Hall of Fame. The only one that isn't is Bill Pellington. And the debate centered around the Packers' Ray Nitschke, who'd been in the league for about 10 years, the Bears' Dick Butkus, who just finished his 3rd season, and the Falcons' Tommy Nobis, who was a second-year pro. Now, it was Nobis who finished first-team All-Pro in 1967, not Butkus or Nitschke. And here you see the rookie cards of the 3 of them. And reading magazines such as this one inspired me to add the Nobis card to my collection. He was an outstanding player who was on the cusp of making the Hall of Fame the past couple of years, but he's largely forgotten in the hobby. And I just love the look of this card. He looks like a linebacker should, with that thick neck, full face, and flat top haircut. Now, this article taught me a lot about these players. Of the 3, Butkus was the only one that called the plays for the defense, which went against the perception of some that thought he wasn't very bright. There were concerns in this article, though, that he wasn't fast enough in pass coverage, but a couple guys argued that he still got the job done. Nobis was viewed as the one with the best upside and was the quickest of the 3. Unfortunately, Nobis and Butkus played for bad teams, which impacted their legacy some. Now, Nitschke was viewed by Pellington, Schmidt, and Richter as the best, or Bill George, who starred also at linebacker with the Bears, picked Butkus. Maybe a bit of a homer decision. And then you had Bednarik, who went with Nobis. Bednarik felt that Nobis was the best because of his speed and that he shined on terrible teams, similar to how he did on some bad Eagles teams in the 1950s. Now, they all acknowledged that the game has changed since they played and was far more complicated defensively than when they played, and that Nitschke, Butkus, and Nobis would likely be considered all-time greats when it was all said and done. Now, I enjoy going through this magazine and just bringing some of these players to life, and now when I look at the Tommy Nobis rookie card, I just have more of an appreciation for it, knowing that he really was at the caliber of Butkus and Nitschke back in his days as a player. And it's just stuff that I really find endearing as a collector. The other article I want to share is this great interview with Al Kaline. What is interesting is the interview takes place prior to the 1968 season, which of course was the year that the Tigers won the World Series. He was asked about not making the World Series, and he said he would love to make it, but he thought the fact that he didn't make the World Series was unfair, and he's not going to go in the insane asylum if he doesn't ever play in one. Now, of course, we know that Kaline was a huge contributor in the 68 World Series, where the Tigers defeated the Cardinals in 7 games. He batted .379 with 2 home runs and 8 RBIs. Now, one of the things that the article talked about was that in the 1950s, the American League had so many superstars like Mantle and Berra and Rizzuto, Ted Williams, Whitey Ford, and Bob Feller, but now there are only really a couple superstars in baseball. And Kaline believed that was due to young players coming up in the big leagues quickly, and even though they have the ability as to be superstars, they struggle and they lose their confidence, and they never live up to their talents. He said while the average player now is better than the average player when he first came up, there are not as many great players nowadays. He said too many guys are trying to hit home runs today, and it's impacting their batting average. Boy, that sounds a lot like baseball today. He also said that relief pitchers are much better than when he first came up, but the starting pitchers were better back then. I thought it was interesting that the interviewer said to him that you certainly have stature, but you're not a superstar like Frank Robinson or Mickey Mantle and now Carl Yastrzemski. Again, I can go into my collection and pull these players out from 1968, and I can relate to the kid in 1968 that was collecting these cards. And the interviewer also said, you're not like Willie Mays or Hank Aaron either. And Kaline, he responded to the interviewer, and I thought it was just very interesting, his response. He said that he doesn't have the makeup of a superstar. I think the guys you mentioned are better players than I am, and possibly a little more exciting too. These fellows have played in World Series, and Kaline said he could not hold his own with all of them in home runs and possibly in batting average, but there's a thin line between them and himself. And I also learned in this article that he was almost traded in 1967 due to the Tigers having too many outfielders. He didn't say to who, but he said he wouldn't have retired, or he would have retired, unless he was traded to 2 teams that he was okay playing for. And the interviewer speculated that it was the Yankees and the Angels that Kaline would be willing to play for, but Kaline never confirmed that. So while I'm still trying to figure out my focus for 2024, I know it will continue to include combining magazines and cards, as I find learning about the players that were stars of their day to be one of the most important parts of my collecting journey. It makes me feel like that kid sitting on his bed thumbing through those cards and learning about the heroes of the day. Everybody have a great Christmas, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.